David Cooper adjusted his tie and scanned the line of customers waiting in the bank's opulent lobby. The sunlight streaming through the towering glass windows gleamed off the marble floors, highlighting the polished elegance of the space. David took pride in working here, not because of the bank's prestigious reputation, but because it gave him an elevated sense of authority. He liked to think of himself as a gatekeeper, separating those who belonged from those who didn't. He spotted Marcus Carter the moment he walked in. Marcus was tall, broad-shouldered, and dressed casually in dark jeans and a simple gray polo shirt. His sneakers, though clean, stood out starkly against the sea of polished loafers and tailored suits. David's eyes narrowed. Marcus didn't fit. Approaching the counter with a calm demeanor, Marcus spoke to one of the tellers, who quickly pointed toward David's office. The teller hesitated before doing so, glancing nervously at David as if preemptively apologizing for what was about to unfold. David sighed. "I suppose I'll have to handle this myself," he muttered, straightening his blazer as Marcus approached. "Good morning," Marcus began, extending a hand. "I'm Marcus Carter. I'd like to open an investment account." David didn't take the offered hand. Instead, he gave Marcus a slow, disinterested once-over, from his shoes to his watch, a functional but modest piece. His lips curled into a practiced, condescending smile. "Well, Mr. Carter," David began, leaning back in his chair, "we have a variety of accounts, but they're tailored to specific financial profiles. Are you sure this is the right bank for you?" Marcus raised an eyebrow but kept his tone steady. "I'm quite sure." David gestured toward a chair, but his words didn't match the polite gesture. "Please sit. Let's see if we can find something suitable." Marcus sat down, his posture relaxed. "I'm looking for a high-value investment account. I'd like to deposit an initial amount of—" David cut him off with a raised hand, already pulling a basic checking account brochure from his desk. "Let's start small, shall we? We have a beginner's account that might be a good fit while you build credibility." Marcus's jaw tightened slightly, but he didn't react otherwise. "I don't need a beginner's account. I'm prepared to transfer $750,000 today, with additional investments over the next few months." David froze for a fraction of a second, the number jolting him momentarily. He recovered quickly, forcing a dry laugh. $750,000. He leaned forward, his smile now almost predatory. "Mr. Carter, that's quite a claim. I assume you can provide proof of these funds?" Marcus met his gaze evenly. "Of course. I came prepared with all the necessary documents." David waved dismissively. "That won't be necessary for now." He folded his hands on the desk, his tone turning patronizing. "Let me explain something about how this works. Our investment accounts aren't just about money. We have a certain clientele, people with established reputations. You understand, don't you?" Marcus's expression didn't falter. "I do understand. That's why I chose this bank. Now, would you like to see my documentation, or should I speak to someone else?" David laughed outright, this time a short, sharp sound. "Someone else? I'm the senior manager here. If you're expecting special treatment, I'd suggest a community credit union. They might be more accommodating." The silence that followed was palpable. Marcus's calm exterior didn't waver, but his eyes locked on David with a quiet intensity. "I don't expect special treatment," he said, his voice firm but measured. "I expect professional treatment. There's a difference." David's smile faltered briefly before returning, colder now. "Professional treatment, Mr. Carter, is ensuring our time isn't wasted. So, let me save you some trouble. This type of account isn't usually realistic for someone in your position." "My position?" Marcus asked, his voice edged with steel. David gestured vaguely. "You know what I mean." "I don't," Marcus replied evenly. "Why don't you spell it out?" David leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. "Look, this bank caters to individuals with a certain lifestyle, connections, a financial track record. I'm not saying you don't belong here, but—" He let the implication hang in the air, confident it would land. Marcus stood abruptly. The chair scraped against the floor, drawing the attention of nearby employees. He adjusted his watch, his movements deliberate. "Thank you for your time, Mr. Cooper," he said, his voice calm but carrying an unmistakable edge. "I'll be in touch." David smirked as Marcus turned to leave. "I'm sure you will." As Marcus walked through the lobby, David watched him go, shaking his head slightly. "Some people don't know their place," he muttered under his breath, loud enough for the teller nearby to hear. The young teller, shifting uncomfortably, avoided David's gaze. "Maybe he really does have that kind of money," she said softly. David snorted. "And maybe I'm the Queen of England." Later that day, David recounted the interaction to a group of colleagues in the break room. His version of events was exaggerated for effect, each detail dripping with mockery. And then he said he wanted to deposit $750,000. Can you imagine? The group chuckled uneasily, some genuinely amused, others too afraid to call him out. "I mean," David continued, "if he's got that kind of money, why show up looking like he's on his way to a barbecue? No suit, no tie, just sneakers and an attitude." One of the younger bankers, clearly uncomfortable, cleared his throat. "Maybe it's not about how he dresses. If he's got the funds." David cut him off with a sharp glare. "That's not the point. This is a business. Appearances matter." The young banker said nothing more, but the tension in the room was palpable. Unbothered, David returned to his office, confident that his actions would go unquestioned. After all, he'd been with the bank for decades. He knew the rules, knew the clients, and knew how to maintain order. As he settled into his chair, his phone buzzed with an internal memo. Skimming through it, he noted an announcement about the new general manager, set to begin next week. "Another corporate reshuffle," he muttered, rolling his eyes. "Let's hope they're not some diversity hire trying to change the whole system." David chuckled at his own remark, completely unaware of the storm brewing just beyond his office door. The following week, the bank staff gathered in the pristine conference room. David Cooper sat near the head of the table, his usual smug confidence radiating as he leaned back in his chair, fingers laced behind his head. The atmosphere buzzed with speculation. The new general manager would be arriving that morning. David, however, seemed unfazed. "Any bets on who it'll be?" he asked the room with a smirk. "I'm guessing some corporate puppet here to spout buzzwords and waste our time." The others chuckled awkwardly, avoiding his gaze. A junior employee sitting across from him hesitated before speaking. "I heard the new manager's got a strong background in finance. Rumor is they've been successful in turning around underperforming branches." David snorted. "Great. Another bean counter who thinks they can teach us how to do our jobs. If they were that successful, why not stay in their cushy role instead of meddling here?" Before anyone could respond, the door opened and a hush fell over the room. The director of operations entered first, her smile polite but strained. "Good morning, everyone," she began. "I'd like to introduce your new general manager, Marcus Carter." David's smirk froze, his eyes widening as Marcus stepped into the room. Gone were the casual clothes and sneakers. Marcus was now impeccably dressed in a tailored navy blue suit, his polished shoes clicking against the floor. His presence was commanding, his gaze sweeping across the room with quiet authority. He paused briefly as his eyes landed on David, his expression unreadable but intense. The room erupted in polite applause, though several employees exchanged confused glances. David sat motionless, his mind racing to process what he was seeing. "Thank you," Marcus said, his voice firm and steady. "I'm honored to be here and eager to work with all of you to take this branch to new heights." He nodded toward the director, who motioned for everyone to sit. Marcus took his place at the head of the table, directly opposite David. "Before we dive into business, I want to share a bit about my vision for this branch. My focus is on excellence, not just in numbers but in culture. Respect, collaboration, and professionalism will be at the core of everything we do." David shifted uncomfortably in his seat, feeling the weight of Marcus's words. Marcus continued, "I believe this branch has incredible potential, but to unlock it, we'll need to make some changes. That includes holding ourselves and each other accountable." David's jaw tightened. The word accountable hung in the air like a threat. As the meeting progressed, Marcus laid out his plans: updated training programs, stricter policies on client interactions, and a renewed emphasis on diversity and inclusion. Each point felt like a personal jab to David, though Marcus's tone remained neutral and professional. When the meeting ended, Marcus stood and addressed the group. I'll be meeting with each of you individually over the next few days to better understand your roles and gather your input. My door is always open, and I look forward to working together. The employees began filing out, murmuring amongst themselves. David lingered, his usual bravado replaced by unease. As Marcus gathered his notes, he glanced up and caught David's eye. "Mr. Cooper," Marcus said evenly, "a moment, please." David froze. "Of course." The room emptied, leaving the two men alone. Marcus gestured toward a chair, but David remained standing, his hands shoved into his pockets. "I'll be brief," Marcus began, closing his notebook with deliberate care. "We seem to have met before." David forced a laugh. Yes. At the counter last week. I didn't realize you were transitioning into this role." Marcus's expression remained neutral. "I didn't think you had." There was a pause, heavy with unspoken tension. "Look," David began, shifting his weight awkwardly, "if there were any misunderstandings during our last encounter, I'd be happy to clear them up. It was a busy day and—" Marcus held up a hand, silencing him. "No need to explain. I remember exactly how I was treated." David opened his mouth, then closed it again, unsure of what to say. Marcus leaned forward slightly, his gaze sharp. "Let me make one thing clear, Mr. Cooper. My expectations for this team are high. That includes professionalism, respect, and integrity. Not just with clients, but with each other. Do you understand?" David nodded stiffly, his face flushed. "Of course. I've always prided myself on those values." "Good," Marcus said, standing. "Then I'm sure you won't have any trouble meeting them." The dismissal was clear. David turned to leave, his face burning with humiliation. By lunchtime, the entire office was abuzz with speculation about the new manager. David, however, kept to himself, brooding in his office. His mind replayed the morning's events, each moment more infuriating than the last. He couldn't believe it. The man he had dismissed so casually now held the power to control his future. Worse, Marcus had handled the situation with poise, not giving David any room to regain his footing. As the day wore on, Marcus began his individual meetings with employees. Each one emerged from his office looking thoughtful, some even inspired. By late afternoon, David was called in. When he entered Marcus's office, he noted the stark difference from his own. The decor was minimal but elegant, with a single framed photo of Marcus and what appeared to be his family on the desk. "Mr. Cooper, please sit," Marcus said, his tone polite but firm. David complied, forcing a smile. "Let me just say, I'm looking forward to working with you." Marcus didn't return the smile. "I appreciate that. Let's talk about your role." For the next 20 minutes, Marcus asked pointed questions about David's responsibilities, his approach to client relationships, and his thoughts on the branch's performance. David tried to maintain his composure, but it was clear Marcus wasn't merely interested in his answers. He was evaluating him. Finally, Marcus leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. "You've been with the bank for a long time," he said. "That kind of tenure can be valuable, but it also comes with challenges. Complacency, for one." David stiffened. "I wouldn't describe myself as complacent. I've consistently met my targets and brought in high-value clients." Marcus's gaze didn't waver. "Perhaps. But targets are only part of the equation. How we achieve them matters just as much. I'll be reviewing past client interactions to ensure our standards have been met. Any concerns will be addressed promptly." David's stomach sank. "Of course. I welcome the feedback." "Good to hear," Marcus said, standing. "I expect nothing less from someone in your position." As David left the office, his mind raced with worry. Marcus wasn't just here to lead. He was here to clean house. And David was at the top of his list. The office hummed with its usual rhythm, but for David Cooper, every sound felt amplified. The distant ringing of phones, the tapping of keyboards, and, most of all, the faint chatter that followed Marcus Carter wherever he went. David couldn't escape the looming presence of the new manager. It had been 2 weeks since Marcus's arrival, and the changes were already evident. Client interactions were now scrutinized, with managers required to provide detailed reports on how they handled sensitive cases. Marcus personally implemented mandatory workshops on diversity, professionalism, and inclusion. Most employees welcomed the new policies, but for David, each session felt like a direct attack. "Can you believe this?" David grumbled to one of his few remaining confidants in the break room. "Now we have to sit through lectures about treating people with respect, as if I don't already know how to do my job." The younger banker shifted uncomfortably. "I mean, maybe it's not such a bad idea. There have been complaints in the past." David's eyes narrowed. "Complaints?" "Well," the banker stammered, "not just about you, about, everyone. You know, culture stuff." David slammed his coffee mug onto the counter. "I've been here for over 20 years. I know what's best for this bank, and I certainly don't need a lecture from someone who—" The door opened, and Marcus walked in, silencing David mid-sentence. "Good morning," Marcus said, his tone polite but sharp enough to command attention. David forced a tight smile. "Morning." Marcus nodded toward David's mug. "I hope you'll bring that energy to today's meeting. We'll be discussing some of your past cases." David's grip tightened around the mug, but he said nothing. The meeting room felt colder than usual as David sat at the long table, a file in front of him labeled with his name. Marcus sat across from him, his posture relaxed but his eyes sharp. A legal compliance officer, Ms. Grant, sat beside Marcus, her neutral expression giving nothing away. "We've reviewed several of your recent interactions, Mr. Cooper," Marcus began, flipping through a folder. "Some of your long-standing clients seem very satisfied with your work." David relaxed slightly, allowing a smirk to return to his face. "But," Marcus continued, "there are also concerns. Recurring themes in how certain clients, particularly new ones, have been treated." David frowned. "Concerns? I don't understand." Marcus slid a document across the table. "This is a formal complaint filed last year. A prospective client described feeling dismissed and disrespected during their meeting with you. Sound familiar?" David scanned the paper, his chest tightening. He vaguely remembered the incident. A young woman seeking a loan he didn't believe she could afford. "I recall the case," David said cautiously. "She didn't meet the qualifications." "I was just being realistic," Ms. Grant interjected. "The issue wasn't her qualifications. It was how you handled the conversation. Comments about her appearance, her lack of sophistication, those were noted in the complaint." David's face flushed. "That's ridiculous. I was being honest. Clients appreciate honesty." Marcus leaned forward, his tone calm but cutting. "There's a difference between honesty and condescension, Mr. Cooper. And this isn't an isolated incident." He opened another file, revealing a stack of similar complaints. David felt a bead of sweat form at his temple. "These are all formal grievances filed in the past 5 years," Marcus continued. "Some were dismissed. Others were never properly escalated. But the pattern is clear." David swallowed hard. "Are you suggesting I'm not qualified for my position?" "I'm suggesting," Marcus said, his voice steady, "that your approach needs serious evaluation. This isn't just about you, Mr. Cooper. It's about what this bank stands for." The silence in the room was deafening. "What are you going to do?" David asked finally, his voice barely above a whisper. Marcus exchanged a glance with Ms. Grant before speaking. "Here's the situation. We're giving you an opportunity to address these issues. That means additional training, closer monitoring, and a commitment to improving your behavior. If you're unwilling, we'll have to explore other options." David's heart sank. "Other options?" "Resignation," Marcus said bluntly. David stared at him, his mind reeling. The room spun, the weight of his past mistakes crushing him in an instant. "Take some time to think about it," Marcus added. "But understand this. Things are changing, with or without you." The hours after the meeting passed in a haze for David. He locked himself in his office, avoiding eye contact with his coworkers, replaying Marcus's words over and over. By late afternoon, there was a knock at his door. It was Ms. Grant. "Mr. Cooper," she said, her voice softer than before, "I wanted to give you this." She handed him a document outlining the proposed re-education program. "It's not personal." Marcus believes in giving people a chance to grow. David scoffed. He wants to humiliate me. Ms. Grant shook her head. He wants to hold you accountable. There's a difference. As she left, David stared at the document, his pride warring with a growing sense of dread. At the end of the day, as the office emptied out, David found himself lingering in the lobby. Marcus appeared, speaking quietly with a few employees, his demeanor approachable yet commanding. David watched him, a bitter taste in his mouth. But as Marcus turned and their eyes met, something in his expression shifted. It wasn't gloating or triumph, it was resolve. "Mr. Cooper," Marcus said, approaching. David braced himself. "This isn't easy for you, I'm sure," Marcus said, his tone almost sympathetic. "But change rarely is. If you're willing to make the effort, I believe you can still contribute here." David blinked, surprised by the sincerity in Marcus's voice. "Why are you doing this?" he asked, his voice low. Marcus's expression hardened slightly. "Because this isn't just about you, Mr. Cooper. It's about everyone who's been dismissed, overlooked, or mistreated. People like me, who've had to fight twice as hard for half the respect." David opened his mouth to respond, but no words came. "Think carefully," Marcus said, stepping back. "You've been given an opportunity. Not everyone gets that." As Marcus walked away, David stood frozen, the weight of his choices pressing down on him. For the first time in his career, he wasn't certain of his place, and the uncertainty terrified him. The weeks that followed were the most grueling of David Cooper's career. The re-education program was intense and, to him, humiliating. Each session was a stark reminder of his shortcomings. Videos of clients describing the impact of dismissive service, role-playing exercises where he had to practice empathy, and lectures on recognizing unconscious bias. David sat through it all with his jaw clenched, nodding mechanically when prompted. But beneath the surface, frustration churned. He hated being scrutinized, hated the whispered conversations among his colleagues, and most of all, hated the knowledge that Marcus Carter had orchestrated it all. One afternoon, during a workshop on diversity, the instructor posed a question to the group. "Can anyone recall a time when a personal bias may have influenced a professional decision? Be honest, this is a safe space." The room fell silent. A few employees avoided eye contact, while others shifted nervously in their seats. David stared at his notepad, determined not to participate. "Mr. Cooper," the instructor said, her tone gentle but firm. "Would you like to share?" David looked up, his face tightening. "I don't think I have anything relevant to add." The instructor smiled patiently. "That's okay. But sometimes acknowledging our blind spots is the first step toward growth." David said nothing, his grip on the pen tightening. Later that day, David found himself alone in the break room, nursing a coffee that had long gone cold. Marcus entered, setting his briefcase on the counter as he poured himself a cup. "You've been quiet lately," Marcus said casually, his tone devoid of malice. David didn't respond immediately. "What do you expect me to say? Every time I open my mouth, someone's waiting to call me out." Marcus leaned against the counter, studying David. "No one's out to get you, David. This isn't about punishment, it's about accountability." David scoffed. "Easy for you to say. You walk in here like some kind of savior, and suddenly we're all the villains." Marcus's jaw tightened. "You think I asked for this? To spend my days cleaning up messes left by people like you?" The words stung more than David expected. He looked up, meeting Marcus's gaze. For the first time, he saw more than just authority in Marcus's eyes. There was fatigue, pain, and something deeper, resolve. Marcus continued, his voice softer now. "Do you know how many times I've been underestimated? How many doors I've had to force open just to be taken seriously? And when I finally get here, I'm expected to pretend none of it matters." David looked away, unable to hold Marcus's gaze. "This isn't about making you feel small," Marcus added. "It's about making sure no one else feels the way I did when I walked into this building." By the end of the week, David's frustration began to crack, giving way to something unfamiliar, reflection. The program was forcing him to confront things he had long ignored or excused. One morning, during a routine meeting, Marcus asked David to stay behind. "I wanted to follow up on your progress," Marcus began, motioning for David to sit. David sat stiffly, his hands clasped in his lap. I've been attending the sessions, taking notes, doing what's required. Marcus raised an eyebrow. And what are you learning? David hesitated. That I've made mistakes? The admission tasted bitter. Marcus nodded, acknowledging that is a start. But the real work begins when you ask yourself why those mistakes happened and what you're going to do about it. David frowned, his defenses flaring. I'm not a bad person, Marcus. I've worked hard for this bank. I've brought in high-value clients and kept our numbers strong. No one's saying you're a bad person, Marcus replied. But being good at your job doesn't excuse bad behavior. People deserve respect, whether they're depositing $100 or $100,000. David opened his mouth to respond, but stopped. For once, he didn't have a quick retort. I'm not asking for perfection, David, Marcus said, his tone softening. I'm asking for effort. Can you give me that? David nodded slowly, the weight of his pride pressing heavily against his chest. As the days turned into weeks, David began to change in small but noticeable ways. He made an effort to greet clients with genuine warmth, even those he might have previously dismissed. He listened more during meetings, resisting the urge to dominate the conversation. But the hardest moment came during a scheduled review with Marcus. I've been reviewing your client feedback, Marcus began, sliding a report across the desk. There's improvement, but some clients still feel you come across as distant. David bristled. Distant? I'm just trying to keep things professional. Marcus leaned forward. Professionalism doesn't mean being cold. People want to feel valued, not judged. That's where you've struggled. David exhaled sharply. I'm trying, okay? I can't change overnight. No one's asking you to, Marcus said. But you need to keep trying. There was a long silence before Marcus spoke again. Do you remember the first thing you said to me when I came in to open my account? David stiffened. I didn't realize it was you at the time. Does that make it better? Marcus asked. His voice was calm, but the question cut deep. David stared at the desk, shame tightening his throat. I was wrong. About you. About how I treated you. Marcus nodded slowly. And about how you treated others, too. Don't just apologize to me, David. Make it right with them. That evening, as the office emptied out, David lingered in his chair, staring at the city's skyline through his window. For the first time, he felt the full weight of his actions, not just with Marcus, but with every client, every colleague he had dismissed or belittled over the years. It wasn't just about his career anymore. It was about the kind of person he wanted to be. The final weeks of David Cooper's re-education program brought a quiet transformation. It wasn't dramatic, no grand gestures or sudden epiphanies. Instead, it was a series of small, deliberate changes. David started to approach his work differently, focusing less on the numbers and more on the people behind them. One morning, an elderly woman entered the bank, nervously clutching a worn handbag. She approached the counter with tentative steps, her voice barely audible as she asked for help with a confusing account statement. David watched from his desk, an old instinct bubbling up. Someone else could handle it. But then he stood, adjusting his tie as he walked over to the woman. Good morning, ma'am, he said, his tone warm and steady. How can I assist you today? Her face lit up with relief as she explained her concerns. David listened patiently, guiding her through each line of the statement until her confusion melted away. By the time she left, she was smiling, thanking him profusely. As David returned to his desk, he noticed Marcus standing nearby, observing quietly. Their eyes met, and Marcus gave a small, approving nod before walking away. Later that afternoon, Marcus called David into his office for a final review. How are you feeling, David? Marcus asked as they sat across from one another. David hesitated. Better, he admitted. I didn't expect to say that, but better. Marcus leaned back in his chair, studying him. You've made progress. The clients notice it. So do your colleagues. David nodded, but he still felt the weight of lingering doubt. Do you think it's enough? Marcus paused, choosing his words carefully. It's not about what I think. It's about whether you believe it's enough, and whether you'll keep pushing yourself, even when no one's watching. David looked down at his hands, his fingers laced tightly together. I don't know if I can erase the mistakes I've made. You can't, Marcus said simply. But you can own them. And you can do better going forward. The words hung in the air, heavy but oddly freeing. Marcus slid a document across the desk. This is the conclusion of your program. The choice is yours now. Stay and continue to grow, or walk away knowing you've at least started to make things right. David stared at the paper for a long moment. Then he reached for a pen and signed it. I'd like to stay, he said quietly. Marcus gave a small smile. Then let's move forward. In the weeks that followed, the changes in the branch became more pronounced. Employees felt a renewed sense of camaraderie, clients received better service, and the workplace culture began to reflect the values Marcus had championed from the start. David found himself working harder than ever, not out of fear, but out of a genuine desire to prove he could contribute meaningfully. He approached Marcus occasionally for advice, their conversations becoming less formal and more collaborative. One day, as they worked late in the office, David cleared his throat. Marcus, he began, I owe you more than just an apology. You didn't have to give me this chance, but you did. And I want you to know I don't take it lightly. Marcus looked up from his desk, his expression thoughtful. You've earned it, David. But remember, it's not just about me. It's about every person who walks through those doors. David nodded. I understand that now. Months later, during a quarterly meeting with the entire staff, Marcus stood at the front of the room, reflecting on the progress they had made as a team. This branch has come a long way, he said, his voice steady and confident. But progress isn't a destination, it's a continuous effort. Every one of you has a role to play in shaping our future, and I couldn't be prouder of what we've achieved together. The room erupted in applause, and for the first time, David found himself clapping not out of obligation but out of genuine respect. As the meeting ended, David lingered, watching Marcus interact with the staff. He saw the impact Marcus had made, not just in the bank's operations, but in the lives of everyone who worked there. And for the first time in years, David felt something unfamiliar but welcome: hope. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew one thing for certain: he was ready to meet it head-on. In the months and years that followed, David continued his journey, slowly but steadily rebuilding his reputation and relationships. He became known not just as a capable banker, but as someone who genuinely cared about his clients and colleagues. As for Marcus, his leadership remained a beacon of integrity and fairness. Under his guidance, the branch flourished, becoming a model of what a truly inclusive workplace could achieve. Their paths, once so fraught with tension, became an example of how change, though painful and difficult, could lead to something better.